Good afternoon and welcome to this NQA webinar on Annex SL, the common thread. This is one of several webinars that we've been running recently to prepare ourselves for the new ISO 9001 and ISO 14001 standards. This Annex SL presentation is the second that we are running. It's back by popular demand. My name is Margaret Rooney and I am with you for the next hour or so to make a presentation on Annex SL, but also very importantly to receive questions and comments from yourselves throughout the presentation, which I shall address at the end. We allow about 15 minutes or so, depending how things go, to do that. You don't need a microphone to ask questions. On the right hand side of your screen you should see a box marked chat. You can submit your questions there and I should be able to read through them later on. So what is Annex SL? We've given this the title the common thread because that is literally what it is. It's a common theme throughout all future management system standards and indeed through some existing management system standards. So where does it come from? Well, for those of you that really need to know or would like to know, and there's no need to know, but it comes from an ISO directive, and this directive sets out how international standards should be produced. So it's a very, very detailed document with procedures specific to ISO preparation of ISO documentation. And within that there is an annex known as Annex SL, and that annex sets out how management system standards should be produced. So very detailed procedures, and within that again there's an Appendix 2, and this sets out the high-level structure, identical core text, common terms and core definitions for all management system standards. I suspect many of you are listening in because you are concerned about the forthcoming updates to ISO 9001 and ISO 14001. And Annex SL is very important because it gives common structure to both of those standards. And those of you that are familiar with both of those standards will know that at the moment they don't necessarily line up very well. So the purpose of Annex SL, it ensures that standards can be easily integrated. I'm sure a number of you are already concerned that you are using 2 or more such management system standards, and hopefully this will make life easier for you. So it should allow for easy integration within your organization where you do need more than one standard. And this requirement applies to all management system standards. That would be the full ISO standards, any technical specifications, and any publicly available specifications that you might be using now or in the future. So Annex SL, as I said, comes from an ISO directive. And this Annex SL Appendix 2 sets out that all management system standards should be structured around 10 clauses. And they are as follows. There's a clause relating to scope, normative references, terms and definitions, context of the organization, leadership, planning, support, operation, performance evaluation and improvement. And I'll go through each of these in a moment. Now I mentioned that there are already some standards structured around this Annex SL. For example, ISO 22301 business continuity is currently written around this structure. And as I say, all future management system standards will also be written around this common core structure. So looking firstly at the clause which addresses scope. Now, I'm sure the concept of scope is familiar to you all. It's something you need to think about when you have a management system in place and that system needs to be certified. One of the things we press you very hard on is what precisely is the scope of that system. So we need to be clear about the intended outcomes of the system and the boundaries within which that system is going to operate. I would suggest you're all probably very familiar with this already. So the scope will be specific to each standard. So the scope of the management system will vary depending on the standard that you're using. And there should be alignment between your scope and what you have determined in Clause 4, and we'll come to Clause 4 shortly. That's the context of the organisation. The second main clause is known as Normative References. And this is where other standards that are relevant or useful to the standard that you're using should be referenced. For example, the current FDIS for 9001 references in the Normative References section ISO 9000 2015. This is Quality Management Systems, Fundamentals and Vocabulary. So we have there a normative reference, in other words, another ISO standard which is relevant for the standard that you are using. However, the FDIS 14001 has no normative references. So it's not a requirement to have these references, but there is allowance made in Annex SL for inclusion of them depending on the individual standard, management system standard in use. Then we have our third clause, terms and definitions. And this is where other definitions applicable to the particular standard can be introduced. So if you want to override a definition that's included in a normative reference, you could include it here. So there's no need, therefore, to put every definition into a new standard. You can have specific definitions for that particular sector that you're looking at. In Annex SL itself, if you look at the actual ISO directive, there are already 21 generic definitions. And these include terms such as interested party, top management, risk, and outsource. And these are terms that are common across all the management system standards, and you'll come across them a lot, whichever standard you find yourself using. And there are in fact 33 terms and definitions included in the 14001 FDIS, but there are no additional definitions in the 9001 FDIS. This again simply refers to the fundamentals and vocabulary document, the ISO 9000. But the point I'm trying to make really is that these clauses are there because they are common to all future management system standards. We move now into the real meat of our management system standards with Clause 4, context of an organisation. Now again, remember, this clause title is common to all future management system standards. So what do we mean by this? Well, context includes consideration of goals and intended outcomes, internal and external issues, relevant interested parties and their requirements. Notice the emphasis I've placed on relevant interested parties. The management system scope. There will clearly be a link between the scope that you want and the context within which you are working. And I've just added a quote there from a Chartered Quality Institute briefing note on Annex SL. Collectively, these provide a key insight into the organisation. When we're looking at context, try not to approach it as a tick list, but just to consider everything that could provide a key insight into your organisation. So what does the Annex SL clause 4 look like? It's divided into several sub-clauses. 4.1, understanding the organisation and its context. Understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. Interested parties could include our customers, our paying customers, our indirectly paying customers if you're a public sector organisation. It could be our regulators. It could be society at large or pressure groups. So there's a whole range of parties, interested parties you may need to consider. And then we need to determine the scope of the management system. The X's are taken directly from Annex SL, recognizing that there will be different sectors applying these standards and therefore different management systems. So I have here the 9,000 fundamentals and vocabulary definition of context. And we've used a lot of this terminology already. It's a combination of internal and external factors and conditions that have an effect on your approach to your products, services, investments, and interested parties. And there are a couple of notes to this definition. The concept of context is equally applicable whether you're a not-for-profit or public service organisation or seeking profits. And in English, this concept is often referred to by other phrases such as the business environment, organisational environment, or ecosystem of an organisation. It's stated there as in English because, of course, we're looking at an international standard, and this doesn't necessarily translate directly across into the other ISO languages in use. Now, I hope I'm not labouring context too much. It's just it does raise a lot of questions. So we here at NQA have given this a lot of thought. And I myself feel very often that we can give you lots of definitions and explanations, but sometimes a few examples might help to make the point more easily. So I'd like you to think of the following types of organisations, to name but a very few, all of which hold NQA certificates of various kinds. So a water company is a public limited company, very large, very complex, different in many ways from a university, another very large, very complex organisation dedicated to education and research. So it's appealing to a different governance structure, a different type of client, if you like, and motivated quite differently from a water company, I would suggest. A building control department within a borough council. This is a public sector area, answering ultimately to elected members. So they'll be operating to some extent perhaps in a political arena. They also have to operate within a very tight regulated arena. So this is a very different context again. Interestingly, by looking at the building control department, we have there a definition of a scope. In certain circumstances, we are not including in the scope the whole borough council. We are limiting the boundaries of that to our building control department. Think of a family landscape business operating from an office in the back garden. A very different context again, much smaller, much less formal, working quite differently to a different set of masters, if you like, than the other organizations that we've been looking at. And finally, another fairly typical example that we come across would be something like a relatively small electrical contractor operating well down the supply chain and required to be highly flexible. Now again, is a very different set of circumstances where they have to respond rapidly. So not a lot of room for formality in some of these situations. So I hope that gives you a little bit of insight to context. I would suggest that those of you who have been working with management systems and management system standards for a while already are aware of context, and you probably operate to it intuitively. But the interesting thing about Annex SL and the new standards in general is a lot of intuition, I think, has become more explicit, being spelt out more clearly. I've just had a question here. Are we going to make this presentation available? Yes, Bob, we are. This presentation will be available on YouTube, but the slides will also be sent to you after today. Thank you for reminding me of that. That's just a little summary of what I've been saying, that each of the organizations we just looked at is very different in governance, complexity, customer base, speed of response, speed of decision making, and degree of formality required. And all of these should influence how we manage or how we view the management system requirements, and therefore how an auditor should arrive at his or her conclusions. The next clause within our Annex SL is the leadership clause, and again this breaks down into several sub-clauses. Leadership and commitment, I think that's fairly self-explanatory. Policy. Now the important thing here is that leadership is a new term that has come in with Annex SL. Previous versions of standards tended to talk about management and management commitment. The emphasis now is on leadership, and leaders need to be seen to be very involved in the policy, and we'll come to that in a moment. And then organizational roles, responsibilities and authorities. Again, I think that's something that's probably quite familiar to you all. So as I said, the emphasis now is on leadership and not just limited to management. Top management now have to have a greater involvement in the management system, or perhaps more correctly, need to be seen to have a greater involvement in the management system. It's got to be very much led from the top, if you like. And very importantly, and again Annex SL brings us this emphasis, that whatever management system we are implementing, it's got to be integrated into the organization's overall business processes. It's not just a bolt-on, it's an integral part of the overall business. Now I know some of you are sitting thinking, yes, we do that already, and you probably do. From where we auditors sit, it varies enormously how well integrated management systems are into the overall business. And the better the leadership and the better the understanding of leaders of the management systems, the better you're going to have that integration. So the involvement has to be explicit and hands-on. The requirements around the policy has been strengthened, and again the policy has to link very clearly to the overall business direction, business strategy, business processes, and has to be driven by the leaders. And very interestingly, within this section on leadership, which includes responsibilities and authorities, there's no longer an explicit requirement for a management representative. Now, that's not to say you don't keep your management representative if you've got one, but interestingly, there's no explicit requirement for a separate role of that type, because the enhanced emphasis is on leadership generally and everyone's involvement in the management system. So again, I've just lifted something from the Chartered Quality Institute's briefing note on Annex SL, which suggests that the requirements now for leadership are much more specific and tangible, and the evidence required should be more obvious. So those of you who are thinking ahead to your auditors coming in, whatever management system standard you're adopting, could begin to think how you might demonstrate this. Planning, as a title, I think is fairly self-explanatory. But again, in Annex SL, we're introduced now to the concept of risks and opportunities. So in our planning, we need to think about what actions do we need to address risks and opportunities. And that presupposes we have thought about our risks and opportunities. So this is a theme very much brought to us by the Annex SL requirement. And then we need to have objectives and determine how we are going to plan to achieve those objectives. Those objectives will be linked to our risks and opportunities. So they might be our quality objectives, environmental objectives, health and safety objectives. You slot in whatever system it is, and therefore whatever relevant objectives you are addressing. So as I've said, it now includes reference to and a requirement to consider risks and opportunities. And risk is defined within the 9000 Fundamentals and Vocabulary document, and the definition is extended with a little bit of explanation. The consequences of an event and the associated likelihood of occurrence, and you need to think about how to avoid, eliminate, minimize or mitigate that risk. The strict definition of risk is quite brief. It's the effect of uncertainty. Don't forget to focus on the positive aspects. Your business has opportunities as well as risks, but those opportunities in themselves will bring an element of risk. Again, I would suggest we all work with risk all the time. You're not necessarily calling it risk, you're not necessarily thinking of it as risk. And this is just another example of where the future management system standards are making risk more explicit. So there should be a clear path from the issues and requirements. Requirements could be regulatory requirements, client requirements, through to consideration of the risks and opportunities, and that should lead to your policies and objectives. So hopefully there's a good logical link throughout all of these requirements. Moving now to the clause known as support. And within that, again, we have several subheadings. We have a need for resources for our management system, competence. I think we're all familiar with the need for competence and what that might be. Awareness. I would suggest that the requirements around awareness have been enhanced within Annex SL, that everyone in the organisation should be aware of the management system and, very importantly, aware of their role and potential impact within that. and a requirement for communication. Annex SL emphasizes the importance of internal and external communications. And then we're back in our comfort zone, documented information. And this particular requirement within Annex SL is further broken down into general requirements for documentation, creating and updating of those documents, and control of documented information. So, what does all this mean? Well, clearly we need to supply competent resource to deliver our goods and services effectively, competent people, appropriate resources up to the task. As I mentioned before, awareness has been strengthened in Annex SL, so everyone needs to know the implications of not conforming to the management system requirements. The implications of not conforming, that's just another way of saying risk. They need to know the risk to them of not conforming to the management system. The requirements for awareness and communication, as stated within Annex SL, are crisper. And as I've already said, the organisation needs to think about both internal and external communication. But very importantly, you need to think carefully: what, when, and with whom will you communicate? And the requirements for the management of documented information are not new, exceptional, or excessive. I think if you read the requirement there, there's nothing terribly different, perhaps, to what you already do. So just to bear in mind that these things that I'm going through in Annex SL, this carries over into whatever management system standard you will be operating. So what I'm saying is true whether you're looking at quality, health and safety, environment. And very interestingly, the terms procedure, manual and records are not used in Annex SL, and therefore they are not used in the management system standards that you will see going forward from here. And just to remind you, do take the opportunity to ask questions or make comment. And we have a few minutes at the end to address those. Now we move to the next area of Annex SL, the common structure of all management system standards. This is number 8, operation. Now it's actually a very short clause within Annex SL, but it's here that there is greater scope for expansion into sector-specific content. And if any of you have looked yet at the FDIS 9001, you will see that Clause 8 is pretty big. And this is because the quality profession has taken advantage of the scope for expansion into its own requirements. If you look at this section in 14001, there are some additional requirements to operation, but it's nowhere near as substantive a clause as in 9001. My colleague is telling me it runs to 9 pages in 9001. Right. So I've reproduced here, will be reproducing here in this clause 8.1 the Annex SL text directly. I haven't done that very much, but I think it might be helpful here. So if you look at Annex SL or look at 8.1 in any future management system standard, you will see these words. So the organisation shall plan, implement and control processes needed to meet requirements and implement the actions determined by 6.1, just to remind ourselves that 6.1 is actions to address risks and opportunities. So our operational controls are about how we manage those risks and opportunities. And in Clause 8, we are looking at our core activities. What is it we're actually here to do? So we must establish criteria for our processes, implement control of those processes, keeping documented information to the extent necessary to have confidence that the processes have been carried out as planned. Again, I suspect you're very familiar with that concept of the extent necessary to have confidence. And what's going to influence the extent necessary? It'll be the risk that you have judged is present. And again, you'll note we need to keep documented information. Annex SL is not prescriptive about what type of documentation or what it should look like. And of course, you need to control planned changes and review the consequences of unintended changes, taking actions to mitigate adverse effects. Again, it's our old friend risk making an appearance here. Don't forget that, of course, your outsourced processes need to be controlled, and Annex SL recognises that. And just to remind ourselves that 8.1 does make direct reference to 6.1, actions to address risks and opportunities. So that's the operational clause that you would see, the introductory clause in any of the management system standards. Thereafter, each sector has the scope, the freedom to write clause 8 as they think fit. So, at its core, the organisation, as we've already said, needs to plan, implement and control its processes. You need to address both your in-house and any outsourced processes. I think again Annex SL enhances the emphasis on outsourcing, recognising that increasingly businesses often make more and more use of outsourced processes. And really nothing terribly new on this slide. This is where the bulk of each discipline requirements will be. And it's really in Clause 8 that you would really need to understand fully the business context. And that's our Clause 1, the context. Clause 4 is key to the sharp end of the business operations. And just to remind ourselves that Clause 4, context of the organisation, Clause 1 is the scope. So within the context of the organisation, we determine what operational controls we're going to need. Right, Clause 9, performance evaluation. This is where we check our outcomes, if you like, from our Clause 8 activities. So what does Clause 9 look like? We have our sub-clauses, monitoring, measurement, analysis and evaluation. Monitoring, measurement, analysis, I suspect you're fairly familiar with those concepts and work with them. Evaluation, now those of you who already use 14001 will be familiar with the term evaluation, but it's a new term in other sectors. And evaluation is about taking all that information that we get from our monitoring, measurement and analysis and reaching a judgment. And the judgment we reach will be determined, I would suggest, by the context within which we are working. So a certain set of results, if you like, you may evaluate are acceptable in one situation but not acceptable in another. So it's where our professional judgment may need to come in. And within performance evaluation, we have to carry out internal audit, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with that, and there aren't any great changes here as far as Annex SL is concerned. And management review is another tool that we use for performance evaluation, a high-level tool for performance evaluation. And again, no enormous changes here as far as Annex SL is concerned. Going back to clause 9.1, there's just a note included within there. This is not a reproduction of 9.1, it's just a reproduction of a note within this. The organisation shall retain appropriate documented information as evidence of the results. So this is just an example of how Annex SL is not being prescriptive about what type of documents or how you present them. And then just a reminder that the organisation shall evaluate the performance and effectiveness of, and it might be the environmental performance and effectiveness of the environmental management system, for example. Right, moving now to our last clause, which is improvement. So you will see very much the progression from determining what the needs are, having the processes to deliver what we need, checking or measuring what we get, and then improving. It's very much the plan, do, check, act type of approach that Annex SL has adopted. You see that logic following through. So we've done our measures and evaluation, and there's a requirement within Annex SL to carry out improvement activities. And one of the tools for our improvement will be to look at and analyse our non-conformity and corrective action trends. We need to think about continual improvement. So this is made clear for all management system standards for all sectors that there needs to be an emphasis on improvement. So just reiterating really what I've said, it's where we address non-conformity, corrective action. We need to think about continual improvement. I would suggest that the requirements, if you read this clause, they're familiar and well understood, but very interestingly, you won't find in Annex SL, and you won't find in future management system standards, the term preventive action. It does not appear. And the logic here is that one of the objectives of an effective management system is a preventive action in itself. So just something to note, but I would suggest not to worry too much about. So what are the new challenges that Annex SL brings us? Well, these are just a few thoughts that I have. You may have some further thoughts of your own, but the fact that thinking about context is made explicit. There's a lot in Annex SL which, as management system professionals, I would suggest is not necessarily terribly new. It's just not been spelt out in a standard in quite the same way before. And context, I would suggest, is certainly one of those areas. We have the emphasis now on leadership as opposed to management. So that's a new challenge, if it is a challenge, that Annex SL brings us. The concept of risks and opportunities, again, I think risk has always been there in the management system standards. That's ultimately why they exist, is to address risk, to prevent problems, but we now see the concept made very explicit in Annex SL. Processes, well, there's always been a need, requirement within our management systems to look at processes, but the importance of processes has been very much enhanced within Annex SL and within the future standards, management system standards. Annex SL brings us potentially systems with less documentation. I've not said a great deal about this before now, but if you read through the new standards, there's a lot less emphasis on documentation, there's a lot less prescription around needing documented procedures, for example. The organization implementing the systems has a lot more flexibility to use its own judgment. So there's potentially less documentation, which may or may not present you with a challenge. And I would say avoid the temptation to use Annex SL requirements as a checklist. These headings are really the key to, they're a key to effective implementation, but I think there has to be a subtlety of approach and professional judgment. So these things should be there and will become evident within your management system, but they're not standalone things, as I say, to be used as a checklist. They're things to be borne in mind and things to be aware of, rather than as a checklist. And those of you who will be doing any kind of auditing, internal or external audits, if you look closely at your core processes, all of these other supporting clauses, I would suggest, should come into play, should be reasonably self-evident. That's all that I intend to say now on Annex SL, and it's time now for any questions or discussion points that you may have raised during this. Just to remind you, this presentation has been recorded and is available on YouTube after today, and the presentation will also be emailed to you after today. And indeed, if you have any further questions and comments after today, do feel free to get in touch with us. Right, we don't actually have any questions at the moment, and I'm never sure if that's a good or a bad sign. Hopefully it's very clear to you all, and I've already answered any questions that you might have. If you do have any questions after today, please email them to info, info@nqa.com. Oh, thank you. I've had a comment from Anna Dima. Thank you very much, very enlightening. That's really nice to hear. Thank you. I've got a question from Alan Pringle, who says, is there an expectation regarding process procedures? Well, the emphasis, Alan, now is very much on process as opposed to procedure, but I think what you're hinting at is, should those processes be written down? And I think that's really something to be judged in the context of the situation at the time. Certainly, process flow charts are an extremely useful tool, and it may be not unreasonable, shall we say, to expect to see those process flow charts, or it might be something that you could suggest. And another thank you note from Kieran Brown. Thank you, Kieran. Thank you. Darren Schotter says that he's looking forward to the ISO 9001 2015 webinar next week. Thank you very much for that little bit of promotion, Darren. That's very, very helpful. But yes, there will be another, at least one more webinar on 9001 itself, and of course my colleague Richard Walsh has been delivering webinars on the specifics of ISO 14001. And you can book them on our website. I can say from experience, it's actually very easy to go on our website and register for these webinars. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for the questions and your very positive comments. So I'm reading into the fact that there weren't a huge number of questions, but a number of positive comments, that you're all hopefully feeling reasonably comfortable with Annex SL. Thank you very much for taking time out on a Friday afternoon and time out from your lunch to listen to this webinar. I've very much enjoyed it, and I hope you have too. Thank you and good.
Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar hosted by NQA. My name is Richard Walsh. I'm an assessor for NQA, worked for NQA for 8 years, predominantly working in the field of environment and energy management. Just a couple of sort of housekeeping rules before we start. We are timed to last around about an hour. Previous webinars maybe have gone over by a couple of minutes. It depends roughly how many questions there are. If anybody wishes to ask any questions, on the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a chat box. If you ask any questions in there, I can then see them and will try and answer them as best I can. Depends on the question as to whether I answer it at the end or in the middle. If it's relevant to what we're talking about, I might take the question at the same time. To save you taking loads and loads of notes, the webinar will be made available to you all in a number of formats, both as a PowerPoint presentation with recording. We are recording this and it will be on our YouTube channel and you'll be sent a link to that. And also I believe the slides will be made available as a PDF file. So planning to speak for about 45-50 minutes with about 15 minutes 10-15 minutes of questions at the end if we need that. So what we're going to do, we're going to have a look at the standard itself, have a look at the new 14001-2015 standard. This presentation is based on the FDIS, currently the final draft international standard. We're going to look at the overarching concept, so what does each clause mean? We're going to look at how we as a certification body and indeed yourselves will interpret the various clauses, because at the end of the day our interpretation and your interpretation needs to be the same. And for each clause we'll look at the key concept, so what does it mean, what's it getting at. We will be looking at the requirement, what does it actually require, what's the audit or assessment criteria, and what will we expect to see from yourselves when we come in and do an assessment. So as I say, it is based on the FDIS. The standard itself is due to be published in a couple of weeks' time, and it may change ever so slightly. There are no changes permitted that are likely to affect the meaning of anything. There may be a little bit of wording or sort of some administrative tidy up, things like that, but none of the meaning of any of the clauses will change. So we're going to have a look, as I say, what each clause means, what was intended by the people who wrote the standard, try and ensure that we all interpret these requirements in a consistent manner, look at the evidence we're likely to want to see, and to identify what documents are likely to be needed. There are some new and modified overarching concepts within the standard. You will notice, if you've had a copy of the FDIS, that the Annex A, which is the bit at the back, which is the guidance, is quite a lengthy document. If you compare that to the equivalent document in the ISO 9001 FDIS, it's about 4 times as long. So there's quite a lot of interpretation in there to help us. And indeed, Annex A begins by stating that the whole purpose of it is to prevent misinterpretation of the requirements. But of course, we will audit you against the standard itself, not against the appendix. The standard requires that the AMS has to be suitable to the context of the organisation, and we'll look at that shortly. And again, that is quite a broad concept. As an organisation, you do retain quite a bit of authority and autonomy to decide a lot of things, actually. How to fulfil the requirements, how the requirements are integrated into other business processes, how to incorporate issues related to the context of the system, and we'll see what we mean by that as we go through the presentation, and also consider issues that can be controlled or influenced, and that's not the same. And again, we'll look at that shortly. And the standard itself actually defines over 30 terms and concepts, and we'll just have a quick look at some of those right from the start to clarify any misconceptions. So Annex Section A3 clarifies some of the terms that are to be used, and we need to have an understanding of these in order to make sure that we do come at this from a common approach. We're going to have a look at a few now, but I do suggest if you've got a copy of the FDIS, or indeed when the standard is published, I do suggest that you make yourself familiar with them. So appropriate versus applicable, not the same. The standard defines appropriate as suitable for and implies there is a degree of freedom in that. Whereas applicable, the standard does mean if it's relevant or possible to apply it, then it has to be done. Consider versus take into account, again, you might think those are the same. Not at all. Consider now means, in the context of this standard, it's necessary to think about something, but it can be excluded, and I would suggest where something is excluded, that there is a justification for its exclusion. Take into account means you have to think about it, but it can't be excluded. It has to, as the phrase says, taken into account within the system itself. And then continual and continuous, this is a concept in the current standard. They are not the same. Continual is the word that is used throughout the standard, and continual, I tend to use the analogy, I tend to explain this to people, is continual is a flight of stairs. So it's not a linear progression, it's a step progression, but the movement is ever upwards. Whereas continuous is a ramp, and that is a smooth, never-ending flow of continuous improvement. And as I'm sure you'll all agree, life's just not like that. So we do need to see the word continual used and not continuous. A few of the key definitions that are listed in the standard that we need to just make sure that we understand. Persons doing work under its control, more or less the same as the current version of the standard, but has to now reflect the difference between control and influence. They're not the same thing, but it does cover contractors, subcontractors, and indeed your own staff, and the level of control and influence will vary dependent upon the type of people involved. Environmental performance refers to the environmental results that are achieved whenever the aspects, processes, products, services or systems are managed and controlled. That's what we mean by environmental performance. It's really what the standard is all about, and the standard is there to enhance your organisation's environmental performance. We'll see the words documented information cropping up in a number of places. It has replaced three other terms that are used in the current standard. That's documentation, documents, and records. They are now all under the umbrella of documented information. And again, there are some phrases that crop up. For instance, the standard says retain documented information as evidence of. That means records. Maintain documented information, full stop, means items other than records. And the phrase that does crop up as evidence of, that's not a requirement to meet legal evidence requirements, such as waste transfer notes, air conditioning, leak test records, things like that. But it's an indication that objective evidence needs to be retained. For example, in clause 7.2, which is all to do with competence, it states that the organisation shall retain appropriate documented information as evidence of competence. Compliance obligations, and I've deliberately put legal and other requirements in brackets for two reasons. One, to show what it is or what they are, but also the standard does allow, if you wish, to continue the use of the phrase legal and other requirements. And again, we'll look at what compliance obligations are. Generally, they split into two areas. There are mandatory compliance obligations, things that you've no choice over, predominantly pieces of legislation, and then voluntary obligations, which can be contractual commitments, community obligations, ethical codes of conduct, good governance, etc., etc. The intended outcome is what you tend to achieve by implementing an environmental management system. And we'll look for three key requirements. One is that the system provides an enhancement of your company's environmental performance. A second is the fulfillment of compliance obligations, both voluntary and mandatory, and achievement of environmental objectives. And then finally, just another little reminder, the standard has a couple of other words that it keeps using. Ensure means responsibility can be delegated, but not the accountability. And wherever we see the phrase any, that implies a selection or choice. Not going to go through that slide. You can read it for yourselves. That just shows the journey that we've come on since March 1992. So over the last 23 years to get us to where we are today, 3rd of September, 13 days away from the expected launch of the standard. We have seen nothing from ISO to say that it will be any different. So we are expecting the new standard to be live in just less than 2 weeks' time. This shows the journey that the current standard has come on. Starting about 3 years ago, back end of 2012, and resulting in October 2013 with the production of a committee draft, going through then first draft. 2nd of July this year was the final draft international standard, and we are now at the tail end of the voting process where the signatory countries vote on the final standard, and as I say, providing there are no issues, we're expecting publication in 13 days' time. The transition arrangements, both for ourselves and yourselves, are going to be the same for ISO 14001 and ISO 9001. And so we can see at the moment we are roughly where it says ISO 14001 2015 issued, sort of round about end of or beginning of Q3-ish in 2015. From the date of publication, there will be a 3-year transition period during which time you will be expected to upgrade your standard or your system to the new standard. You can take 3 years if you like, but assuming the 16th of September is met on the 16th of September 2018, that's in 3 years' time, any outstanding certificates for people who have not upgraded by that point will automatically expire. However, you can choose any point between the 16th of September and 2018 to take the upgrade. What we're expecting is anybody who's currently implementing the old standard or the current standard, I keep referring to it as the old standard, anybody currently implementing the current standard will still have a freedom of choice to choose which standard to be initially assessed against, up to, we suspect, probably early 2017. I don't think there's a set date yet, but we're anticipating about 18 months, so about halfway through, any new certifications will have to be to the new standard. If you're not sure about any of that, speak to NQA, and either myself or somebody in the office will be able to talk you through that process in much more detail. One of the reasons we need to change is the current standard has been around since 2004, so it's 11 years old, and I think it's fair to say that environmental management and environmental concerns are not the same as they were 11 years ago, and indeed 14,001 as a standard itself has been around since 1996. And it's expected the current standard will have a life of about 10 years. So one of the things we need to look at to ensure with the new standard is that it can capture what we're seeing is increasingly complex environments in which you all operate. It's all about trying to ensure that the new standard reflects the needs of all potential user groups. There have been concerns in the past, both with 9001 and 14001, that they read fine if you're a manufacturing organisation producing widgets, and if you're a service organisation, they're a bit less easy to understand. Hopefully some of that has been addressed by both of the new standards. It's about focusing on corporate governance, and also has allowed, through the use of Annex SL, which I'm not going to go into today. There is another NQA webinar that you can listen to about Annex SL. That is the structure for all the new standards that are now being published, which will ensure that all the standards now can be integrated much easier. They all follow what I've always known as the Deming cycle, the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. No change there at all. And indeed, this slide shows how the clauses of the new standard fit in to the Plan, Do, Check and Act, with clauses 4 to 7 being the planning, clause 8, operation, comes under the Do heading, Check is performance and evaluation, and Act is improvements at clause 10. And indeed, if you haven't seen the standard already, that is now what it looks like. The bits in black are relevant to 9001 and 14001 because, of course, they share the same numbering. The bits in green are the bits that are relevant to both standards but actually have been tweaked to reflect an environmental need. And in about, what we got left, 40 minutes, something like that, we are going to go through all of those clauses from 4 through to 10 and have a look at what each of those sections means. I've not got any questions at the moment, so I'm assuming that everybody's okay. I can see that you're all still there and listening, that's fine. So don't forget, any questions, type them into the chat box and we'll try and cover them as we go along, or at the end if it's more appropriate. I'll carry on moving along, and as I say, I'll wait and see if any questions arise. So the beginning of the standard, clause 4.1, is now called the context of the organisation. And the context of the whole organisation really is about setting the scene as to where the system sits, how the system needs to sit, and what are the issues that need to be addressed by the environmental management system. One thing that's very important, there is quite a key change, if you like, between the current standard, the 2004 standard, and the new 2015 standard. Up to now, most of our focus has been on how we as organisations impact the environment ourselves. So we've looked at prevention of pollution, we've looked at what we put down the drain, we've looked at waste, we've looked at energy use, etc., etc. We now have to take into account how the environment can affect us as businesses, and when we come to look at the clause on aspect identification, which is now going to be called risks and opportunities, we will see that we have to make sure that we are taking into account how the environment might impact upon what we do as a business. So we need to look at the needs and expectations of interested parties. We need to define the scope of the system. And the scope, as with the current standard, can't exclude activities, products and services that can have a significant environmental aspect. So in other words, what are the boundaries of our system? And a slight change, if you've all got 14,001, you'll all be used to the fact that your policy, unlike the policies for quality and the other standards, are not public documents. 14,001 requires the policy to be made public. This standard now requires that the scope, the wording of the scope, which is what you will see on your certificate from us, and indeed should be detailed currently in your manual, the wording of that scope has also to be now available as documented information and available to the public. So the new standard introduces some new requirements that you review and consider. If you remember, we said consider is to take into account, but consider is to look at, but not necessarily have to use, if you like. The context of your organisations, where they sit, what are the needs of interested parties and their requirements. Part of that involves determining the external and internal issues that are relevant to your purpose and that can affect the ability to achieve the intended outcome of the management system. And by doing that, by working out where you sit, it should result in your EMS focusing on the issues that present the greatest risk, be that positive or negative. We're looking for 3 areas to be taken into account. Not going to read all of them out, the bullet points, but the 3 main areas are the environmental conditions. So that's how the environment can affect you as a business. We're looking for external items to be taken into account, be they legal, social, cultural, competition, etc., etc. And then internal issues, the strategic direction of the business, what our capabilities are, what our culture is, etc., etc. And the whole idea of this is to provide a high level, and that's in bold deliberately, a high level conceptual understanding of the important issues that can affect the way in which we as a company manage our environmental responsibilities. The reason that I say high level is deliberately in bold, there is a section we could have come on to called leadership, and that is something that will slightly change the way in which our top management is involved and is indeed impacted by the management system. So we'll look at that when we come on to it. Again, not going to go through this in any great detail. This is just there as an example. Feel free to read it at your leisure. It's looking at the context. One example of context, water scarcity for, say, a multinational food processing company with operations in water-stressed regions. And it goes through, step by step, the processes and the areas that may need to be taken into account. And picking out a few key words, you'll see things like non-governmental organisations, campaigning. You'll see things like technological expertise within the business. We'll see things like climate change in there, damaging of sensitive habitats, and so on and so forth. So there is quite a lot to take into account when we go through this process. Key to the process, and it has a separate section within the standard, is 4.2, interested parties. And that's to understand the needs and expectations of those interested parties. And you have the freedom to choose which compliance obligations you actually comply with. So you need to determine what's relevant and then have a look and see which you choose to comply with. Of course, it could cause problems if you choose not to comply with some of them. However, the only ones you don't have any choice over, of course, are the legislative issues. And remember, voluntary obligations or voluntary arrangements become obligations when agreed and adopted. And an example of a voluntary arrangement might be, for instance, a haulage company where the main access road runs past some houses and they agree, for the sake of the residents, to restrict vehicle movements between the hours of, say, 10 at night and 7 in the morning. Once this has been agreed and adopted, it then becomes an obligation as opposed to a voluntary arrangement. Interested parties, stakeholders, call them what you will, employees, board members, shareholders, neighbours, customers, suppliers, contractors, and to be honest, I could have said anyone with a legitimate interest in the activities of the organisation. So we've quite a lot of people to think about in terms of the environmental management system. We have to decide what we're going to cover and what we're not going to cover, and the standard does allow either the whole of the organisation or a part of the organisation to be certified and to be within the scope of the system. However, you can't use it to exclude significant environmental aspects or to evade compliance obligations. So you can't draw a line around a big old dirty process that you have out the back that you hope nobody sees and say we're going to go for this bit because it's nice and easy. You do need to include significant environmental aspects. But I have a number of clients I work with as an assessor who currently, for instance, because of the activities they're involved in, because it is predominantly an office-based activity, look at the facilities management as the boundary for the management system, because that actually does include all the key environmental impacts. However, the scope hasn't to be misleading. You can't create the image that you are covering everything when you're only covering part of the organisation. And again, we'll be looking at that very, very closely, where the scope doesn't cover everything. And as I've said already, this new requirement that the scope has to be made available externally. The standard requires all organisations to establish a wide range of procedures, and these include aspects, legal requirements, management procedures, an awareness procedure, communications, document control, operational procedures, and so on and so forth. The new standard, you'll be pleased to know, gives you a lot more freedom to decide the level of documentation that you need. And the key phrase is the first bullet point really, to make sure that you have sufficient documentation to ensure that your processes are controlled, carried out as planned, and achieve desired results. It's your decision as to the level of documentation you have. I hear far too often, well, I've got it like this because the standard says I have to have it like that. The standard doesn't say that, or the new standard doesn't say that at all. We'll see a little bit later on, there are a number of areas where documentation is required, but it's far less than current. The other thing is the standard requires that the management system is integrated into the wider business processes. So no longer can we accept, well, the environment that's down the corridor, third door on the left, see Freddie, Beaver's away doing something, but we're not quite sure what he does. We need to see the environmental requirements built in to the whole business process. And one of the key areas that the standard is looking at is the change management process. So if as a business you have the new standard and you are planning changes, whether it's new processes, new premises, whatever it might be, then environmental considerations need to be built in and demonstrated that they're built in right from the start. So I've kept mentioning leadership. Here we go. Clause 5.1, leadership and commitment. Currently, 2004 standard requires commitment from the senior management team, or the top management as it uses. We're ramping that requirement up a little bit with the new standard, and it's leadership and commitment. And leadership is a little bit more proactive than commitment. So we need to ensure that we assign specific responsibilities for those in leadership roles. One of the key ones is to promote environmental management within the organisation. But the standard itself requires top management to provide leadership by accepting total responsibility for it, showing or demonstrating that they support it, and providing resources necessary to run it. So top management is defined as a person or group of people who directs and controls the organisation at the highest level. So if you've got a company-wide EMS, it's basically the board and the managing director. If your EMS has been adopted by just a business unit within an organisation, so you may be a site, part of a multinational company, and it's only your site, and that is the total boundary of the EMS, then whoever the top person or the senior person on that site is, they will become, in the terms of the standard, the top management. But it does require, the standard requires that top management now take accountability for the effectiveness of the system. So as you can see, the 2004 standard responsibilities were only three things really: establish the policy, appoint a management representative, and undertake periodic reviews of the system. A little bit more now. Interestingly, the term management representative has been dropped. There is no longer a requirement for a designated management representative, environmental manager, call them what you will. That's also the same in 9001 for quality management. We, of course, will require still a named contact so that we can liaise with a member of your staff, but the standard itself does no longer say you have to have an individual. However, the top management must make sure that the importance of effective environmental management and conforming to the system is communicated across the organisation. Top management have to direct and support staff who can contribute to the effectiveness of the EMS, support other management roles, promote continual improvement, ensure that the environmental objectives are established, and provide sufficient resources for the EMS. Just notice a question's popped up. I'm assuming that you might have come in slightly late. Please could we get a copy of the slides after the webinar is finished? I did say that right at the very, very start. Apologies if you did step in a couple of minutes after we'd started. Yes, indeed, anybody registered will be sent a link. Not only will you get a copy of the slides, but you will be sent a link to our YouTube channel where you can sit through this whole presentation again. It's being recorded and you can see the whole thing again. I believe also there will be a PDF copy of the slides also being circulated. So I hope that answers that question. Moving on, environmental policy. Have policies now, and the policies as we currently have, the new policy has to be appropriate to the purpose and context of the organisation. It has to be appropriate to the nature, the scale and environmental impact of whatever it is you're doing, and has to be a framework for the setting of environmental objectives. It has to be documented and made available to interested parties. I'm expecting, going back to the requirement for the scope to be made public, I'm expecting the scope to be detailed now as part of the policy statement, maybe to set the scene. As well as being externally available, it also has to be communicated internally. And there is a requirement for 3 basic commitments. So as an absolute minimum, we're looking for the policy to have a commitment to protect the environment. We're going to look at that on the next slide, so I won't go into that in any detail. Excuse me. We're looking for a commitment to fulfill the organisation's compliance obligations. That's very similar to the current statement, which talks about meeting legislative and other requirements, and then to continually improve the system to enhance environmental performance. And again, we'll see that that's a recurring theme, that continual improvement is expected both in our environmental performance and in the system itself. So this section, protection of the environment, it's one of the areas I've had a few concerned clients asking me about. What on earth do we mean by protection of the environment? Protection of the environment is now an umbrella statement. It includes prevention of pollution, but it also includes a number of other areas. So it can include things like sustainable resource use. It can be climate change mitigation, adaptation, protection of biodiversity, water quality, air quality, remediation of land. There's a whole list of things that it can include, and it's not an exhaustive list. Quite often I see environmental policies sitting alongside sustainable development policies. That's also considered to be relevant. However, we will expect to see, and it would be a non-conformance if we didn't, we will expect to see commitments now over and above we will prevent pollution. Right, at what level of management should the management representative be at within the organisation? Again, there is no requirement for a management representative anymore. So you don't have to have one. if you bear with me, when we come on to roles and responsibilities, which is actually the sort of the next main slide, we'll have a look at where that can be. But we need to forget with the new standard that we had management representatives. If you choose to have one, you can still continue to do that. But as you'll see, it can be really at any level, so long as they carry out certain functions. Okay. In answer to Anna's question. So responsibilities and authorities for key roles within the system should be assigned and communicated. So those people involved in the system need to have a clear understanding of not only their role and responsibilities and authorities, but others as well. As we've seen, there is no formal requirement for a management representative. It's now a shared responsibility. Can still be an individual if you choose, but generally it's expected that it will be a shared responsibility. We, as I've said, will still require a named point of contact so that we can deal with somebody when we're booking visits and the like. However you manage it, though, there are two key roles that somebody or a group of people within the organisation need to consider, and that's to ensure that the system itself conforms to the requirements of the standard, and to report on the performance of the system and environmental performance to top management. And top management have a role to establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve the management system through the provision of resources. And I've sort of borrowed a clause, because clause 7.1, which is resources, I've tackling it here because it's part of the senior management, top management commitment. So above all, I think at the moment, time is an issue that needs to be granted to those people involved in the process to make sure that the system is in place. Right, that's the end of that little section. We're now going to move on to section 6, which comes under the heading, the general heading of planning. We're moving on to some slightly more familiar ground, because planning is all about addressing the issues that we identified earlier under the context of the organisation, but identifying those issues that we need to look at to make sure that we can enhance our environmental performance, fulfil our compliance obligations, and achieve our stated environmental objectives. So it's all about now risk management. There is an ISO standard, unsurprisingly, I suppose, on risk management. It's ISO 31000. Not read it, if I'm being honest. However, I've read a little bit, which defines risk as the effect of uncertainty, and also defines an effect as a positive or negative deviation from what is expected. And please just hold that thought, positive or negative. And 14,12015 stresses that risks are potential adverse effects or threats, and opportunities are potential beneficial effects. And the standard requires continual improvement, as I keep stressing, in both the system itself and in the impact on the environment. So what do we expect an organisation to do to determine and address an issue because of the risk it poses, if that risk is significant for you as an organisation? Now that, in the past, we've only ever looked at risks of us damaging the organisation. We now have to take into account a risk that could be caused to us or could be placed upon us by the environment. So we could have to take into account the risk of flooding. There may be risk of climate change. There may be risks related to shortages of materials, a whole load of new areas that we will have to start to take into account. If we decide something could be a risk and it can have an environmental tag hung on it, then we need to consider it. And then, as we see at the bottom, we need to then take action to reduce any potential negative effects. And if it's something that's positive, we can then leverage additional positive effects. We still are required, as we are with the current standard, to prioritise and look for the significant adverse and beneficial effects. The standard still calls them aspects. And again, the standard doesn't tell us how we have to do this. I've seen the most complex Excel spreadsheets with weighting factors and all sorts of things out there. There is no requirement for that at all. You do have the, as the standard uses the term, the organizational autonomy to decide how on earth you're going to carry this out. So it needs to be done in a way that can be explained, that is repeatable, but it can be done entirely how you decide, how you see as best. Environmental aspects, I think we know what they are. They are basically the same as we've got now. Aspects of activities, products and services that can have an impact on the environment, and again, stressed a bit that you can control or influence. However, the big change in this area, and it's another area that I've had a little bit of worry for from some people I've worked with just recently, we have to now look at this as a life cycle perspective. So we have to accept the fact that our impact on the environment and the environment's impact on us is a two-way street. It's not just what we do and how it impacts on the environment, it's how the environment impacts on us, it's looking at where our raw materials come from. We're not looking for, say, a full life cycle assessment, but an acknowledgement within the system that there are what I've started using the term upstream aspects, like I said, raw material, transport, supply processes, as well as downstream aspects. And we'll have a little look at this when we come on to the operational control section. Compliance obligations, not going to spend too long looking at this. This, other than a name change, hasn't really changed. So you can still use the term legal and other requirements. Now, whilst the standard does accept a risk management process, risk management cannot be applied in this area. In other words, you cannot accept the risk of non-compliance. That is not an acceptable risk. You do still have the ability to take the voluntary compliance obligations and decide which ones you choose to comply with, but compliance obligations themselves can also result in a risk. There is also, a little bit later on in the standard, a requirement to evaluate compliance, and again, we'll come on to that a little bit later on. So, clause 614, planning action, and this very much relates to how we as an organisation will address the significant environmental aspects that we've just identified. Now, it's not taking action itself, it's how to plan to take action. So we need to look again at how the actions that we undertake within the AMS and how the things that we identify are built in to our other business processes. We need to consider how we're going to test the effectiveness of things that we put into place and look at the options that we have in place, be it technological, financial, and other business requirements. So this section is very much all about planning to take action, but not actually taking the action itself. Taking the action comes under 6.2 objectives and planning to achieve them. It is a policy commitment. There has to be a commitment for the setting of objectives. You will see that the phrase targets has disappeared, but it's only disappeared in name only. Targets, whilst not in name, still have to be set, in that objectives have to be measurable, monitored, communicated, and updated. So therefore, if it's targets by another name. This section really hasn't changed other than, as I say, that the word target has been removed. And the standard defines the word objective as a result to be achieved, which again is more or less a target. And it's the standard says that significant aspects must be taken into account when setting objectives. Now, if you remember when we said taking account, so it's necessary to think about but cannot be excluded. So if you come up with a number of things that you define as significant, they will need to be in there as objectives. So clause 7, moving on, some of these clauses are very, very similar to what we see in the existing standard, and this one is just the same as that. So it's all about competency, clause 7.2. 7.1 was resources, which we've already looked at. 7.2, competence. It is necessary to determine competency requirements. We need to ensure that people are competent to do the roles that we're setting them. And the standard itself lists a number of people who we will have to define competency for, and as a minimum we will want to see defined competency levels for these people. And these are people who, and it's listed in the standard, who have particular roles: aspect evaluation, people who contribute to the achievement of objectives, respond to emergency situations, carry out internal audits, and carry out evaluation of compliance. And again, the final bullet point, competency records have to be maintained. Awareness, very, very similar. It's a clause with minimal change. We need to ensure that anybody doing work under our control is aware of our policy and the commitments that we've made, aware of our significant aspects and the potential impacts of their work. They need to know how they can contribute to the effectiveness of our system, and also the implications of them not conforming. It does require that people will have awareness of the existence of the system, the purpose of the system, and of their roles. And if I'm being honest, it's a little bit more than I see most of the time, which is people saying to me, well, they've got a copy of our policy. It's a little bit more than that. Communication, again, broadly the same. 2 tiers of communication, internal and external. There needs to be a process on what we're going to communicate, when, with whom, and how. However, the standard does add some additional, not requirements, but pointers. And again, it's something we'll be looking at to ensure the standard requires that communication is transparent, that it's appropriate, so it meets the needs of relevant parties. So are we giving them what they're asking them for? Truthful and misleading. Can't imagine anybody not being, but there you go. Truthful and not misleading. Mustn't exclude relevant information, and particularly key, it must be understandable to relevant parties. So if you're being asked to provide evidence or documentation to a neighbourhood group of stack emissions, it's no good giving them the most complex spreadsheets that they can't understand. The method of communication has to be relevant and understandable. Right, another question. No. Are staff required to have formal qualifications in environmental management to prove competency? Not at all. What levels of qualification would be appropriate for an SME if required? Well, they're not. Competency is not just qualifications. If it was, I wouldn't be sat here. I have no qualifications in environmental management other than being a full member of IEMA and a chartered environmentalist. I'm a mechanical engineer with an ONC mechanical engineering, and that is it. What I do have is 20 years experience in the industry, starting out in 1994 in environmental management with the first standard. So it's not just about qualifications. IEMA will tell you that they would like to see, and I don't blame them for saying it because it's all about membership, they would like to see people as an associate member of IEMA, which does demonstrate some knowledge and competency. But actually, again, it's for you as an organisation to decide what you think is an appropriate level of competency. Just back to communication, and I appreciate the fact that it's just after 1:15, so we will get our skates on. Communication then, 2 levels, internal and external, and this slide shows us what we will be expected to communicate. And again, where I show a table like this, this is giving you some clues as the things that we will be looking for as assessors when we come and assess against the new standard. Not going to read it all out again. It's on the screen, it's in front of you, and you will get copies of these slides in a day or two. Documented information. The key difference here is the phrase within the standard, in a manner sufficient to demonstrate a suitable, adequate, and effective EMS. the requirement for reams and reams of paper and lots of documented procedures has gone. We're not looking for a complex document control system. There are some documents that we'll see on the next slide which are required by the standard, but it's entirely up to you how you show them. Doesn't have to be a manual. Can be, for instance, a series of flowcharts, can be exactly how you choose, whatever works best for you. It's your system, not ours, and it's up to you to set the best form of documentation for you as a business. However you manage it, though, it has to be controlled, it has to be available where required, and the standard now uses this term protected. So in other words, it doesn't go missing, doesn't get damaged, backing up of IT systems, that sort of thing. So there you go. Having said documents and records are terms no longer used, I've used them on here just to, because it's phrases that we're all familiar with. And again, you'll see these are the things I've lifted out of the standard where it says documented information is required. And as I say, some of them are what we think of as documents and some of them are what we think as records. We will be looking for all of those. However else you manage things, that's what we will expect to see as a minimum. And things that have gone, just as a little reminder, there is no requirement to fully document the AMS. So it's up to you what you document. Targets have gone. There is no requirement to formally document roles, responsibilities and authorities, but if you remember, there is a requirement to communicate them. And there is no longer a requirement for a description of the elements of the system. That used to be what the EMS manual was for. You can still do that if you want, if it makes life easy for you, but you don't have to anymore. There was a decision required to be made and documented under communication. That was whether you're going to communicate externally. That's now included in the whole issue about the context of the organisation and what people require from us. And also, as we'll see shortly, the term preventive actions has also disappeared. Okay, Section 8. If you compare Section 8 in 14,001, which is operational control, with Section 8 in 9,001, in 9,001 it runs to about 4 pages. In 14,001 it runs to 1 page. So on the face of it, it's much, much simpler. However, as we'll see, the devil's in the detail, as in most of the life. So there's a couple of things I want to draw your attention to. So, process control is all about establishing processes, A, to meet the requirements of the system and to meet the planned actions that we looked at in clauses 6.1 and 6.2. And if you remember, 6.1 was all about actions to address risks and opportunities, and 6.2 was environmental objectives. So anything we decide we're going to move forward, anything we're going to change, we're going to manage better, we're going to control better, there needs to be processes established for that. And as we've seen at the bottom, they are all in there with one key addition, and that is the control of outsourced processes. The standard now does require, because of the requirement to go back and look at the life cycle approach, it does require a degree of involvement with our suppliers, our contractors, subcontractors, and indeed the purchasing process. One of the things, as I said earlier, I alluded to this earlier on in the presentation, the standard requires that we plan changes such that we can mitigate any adverse effects or any unintended changes as a part of that change process. This is one of the ways that leadership can be demonstrated by top management. So as I said earlier, where an organisation is planning to change something, a significant change to a process or a premises, whatever, we would expect the process, that change process, to involve environmental considerations from the beginning. And the sort of things we're looking for are the involvement of competent people, that there are specifications for the performance of that particular process, that we monitor and measure the results. We use the relevant level of documentation to assure effectiveness. So, life cycle perspective. So this is all about looking at establishing controls in design and development, if that's a process that we have, to ensure that environmental requirements pertinent to the life cycle of our product or process are addressed. A key part of that is determining the environmental requirements for procurement. If you've got a QMS, quality management system, you will have a purchasing process. And that purchasing process will ask you to evaluate suppliers based on performance, delivery, and any other sort of quality criteria you may select. We will now expect to see environment included within that. And indeed, if you place any relevant requirements on your suppliers, you need to communicate that to them. The reason there's an asterisk there is this is how many organisations will get customer compliance obligations. In fact, the fact that you're doing 14001 may be as a result of a customer requirement. And indeed, you could decide that you wish that for your suppliers. It all depends on the level of influence and control that you may have. The standard defines an outsourced process, but outsourced processes are within the scope of the system. So in other words, if you're sending something out, if you're, I don't know, maybe an engineering company and you're sending out some components for heat treatment, that heat treatment process is within the scope of the environmental management system. However, the bottom bullet point is very important, that we will take into account that the level of influence you may have will vary on a case-by-case basis. You may be a very small part of somebody else's business, and therefore your level of influence may be fairly small. Emergency preparedness response, identical to the current standard. The only thing that's changed really is where the information has come from to allow us to determine what the emergencies we have to prepare and respond for are. And again, they will come through clause 6.1, which was the awareness of the risks affecting us as an organisation. And again, as we do now, you can see the requirements to prepare to respond to actual situations, mitigate them as appropriate, evaluate what's happened, what's gone wrong, periodically test them, setting of training and competency levels for the relevant people, and so on and so forth. 2 clauses left, and it's about a minute after 5, so we should be okay, unless I get a deluge of questions. The organisation has to monitor, measure, analyse and evaluate environmental performance, including the system itself. So we need to decide what we're going to monitor, what methods are we going to use to validate those results, do we require calibrated or verified equipment? Probably not in environment unless you're using things like pH monitoring for effluent discharges, maybe noise meters, things like that. We need to set criteria. The standard now does suggest the use of appropriate indicators. 14001's never mentioned KPIs before, but we now will start to see the use of KPIs being required. So how are we going to monitor? How are we going to evaluate the results? And do we need to communicate those internally and externally? And again, there needs to be records maintained, documented information of the results of the monitoring. And again, I keep stressing this includes how the EMS itself is performing. So there may, for instance, be KPIs around the number of non-conformances that you raise in an internal audit process. That's one way of monitoring how the system performs itself. Evaluation of compliance, again, very, very similar to what we've got at the moment. One concept I wish to just ask you to drop out of your mind completely. I see this all the time, and I've had this issue within the last 2 weeks. Evaluating compliance is not updating the legal register. That is in a different part of the standard. Evaluating compliance is all about, are you meeting the requirements placed upon you by currently legal and other requirements with the new standard, by your compliance obligations. Just to point something out, the very bottom bullet point, a non-compliance is not necessarily elevated to a non-conformance if identified and corrected within the scope of the EMS. So both internally and with us, if we see a non-compliance that you've identified, addressed and resolved, it will not be a non-conformance from our end, and there is no need for you internally. So if there is, for instance, a breach of a discharge consent, if you've identified it, actioned it, and resolved it, then that doesn't necessarily have to be a non-conformance within your own system. Internal audit hasn't changed at all, other than the numbering. There needs to be a system in place. There needs to be an audit program. The audit program is based upon a number of criteria. Environmental importance, changes affecting the organisation, results of previous audits. We require the scope for each audit to be defined. One of the things that you can look at is process auditing. It's something that 9001 requires more and more. If you have an integrated system, there is no reason why you couldn't audit a process. You could audit, for instance, I don't know, an electroplating process, and audit that process with one audit, taking into account both quality and environmental requirements. You could go down and do the tried and tested method of carrying out procedural audits, auditing against the procedure. There is, however, and I'm conscious it is 5 o'clock now, so I'll be about two more minutes, that's all. One thing that I wish to stress, and this came out in a couple of weeks ago, we have already carried out our first upgrade audit against the draft international standard, and that is permissible. And on the 16th of September, assuming that the standard is published, then that client will be certified with a, won't go into the technicalities too much, but with a currently unaccredited certification. We will require, as an absolute minimum, that there has been a full internal audit of the system. So a bit like a stage 2 audit, when you sought certification initially, we will require to see that there has been a full internal audit of the entire system against the new standard, because the standard does say that the internal audits are there to ensure that the system is effectively implemented and maintained, and you have to do that as well as us. So if we turn up, as happened a couple of weeks ago, and there hadn't been an internal audit carried out against the new standard, that will be a major non-conformance, and you will not receive a recommendation for an upgrade. The reason I mention it now, we will be communicating this more formally. The client in question assumed that we were going to tell them that that was a requirement, and we assumed that because they'd read and understood the standard, they would realise that. So clearly that's not the case, so we are stressing that particularly. 9.3 management review, again, hasn't changed. There is a requirement that it includes top management. Doesn't have to be done all at one go, can be done over a period of time. Inputs and outputs defined. Basically, the requirements haven't changed, they are still the same. It's just in some cases the terminology has changed to reflect the other clauses of the standard. Finally, clause 10, improvement, and clauses 10.1 and 10.3 talk about continual improvement. You will see that the term preventive action has disappeared. Preventive action is covered in clauses 6.1 and 8.1. And 6.1, as we keep coming back to, is identification of risks, and 8.1 is operational planning and control. For ages and ages, we've been used to thinking of, if something happens, the corrective action is putting it right, and preventive action is stopping it happening again. We need to get that out of our mind. It's not like that anymore. With the new standard, the new concept is short-term corrective action, longer-term preventive action. That's where we are, and therefore we need to, again, take an approach appropriate to what's gone wrong, document the information. I'm sorry we've whizzed through the last little bit pretty quickly. However, most of that hasn't changed from the previous standard. Now, I show this as a deliberate slide. This is a slide I showed to our assessors when I took them through this process, because I've been training our assessors as well. And the slide, as you see, has a quote from Martin Hockaday. Some of you might have met Martin, some probably not. Martin is our environmental sector manager. And this was an article he contributed to that was in the 2015 June 2015 Environmentalist magazine. And the direct quote was, assessing how organisations could be affected by the environment is very different from looking at how its operations affect the environment, and will require assessors to have a deeper understanding about the organisation, its products, services and supply chains. Now, if I take out the word assessors and put your name in, it is equally important. We need to have a much deeper understanding of where we sit within the context of the environment. And it's not, as I've said, just about how we as an organisation impact on the environment. That's me finished speaking. It's 5:05. I am willing to take any further questions if you've got any. I will just reiterate the fact, just move the slide on, there you go. I will reiterate the fact, as you can see, that it's been recorded and is available, or will be available, on the NQA YouTube channel. You can also listen to, this is the third time I've done this presentation, you can listen to the other ones as well, see if I said the same thing. I can assure you I have. And also we'll email the presentation to you as a PDF. There's no other questions by the look of it from what I can see. There's nobody appears to be typing. I'll hang on just a second, see if anything else comes in. Other than that, doesn't appear to be anything else. I'll thank you for your time. Thank you for your attendance. Hopefully see some of you out and about if I do get in to see any of you as businesses. If you have any questions that you think of after we've hung up, feel free to email me. My email address is richard.walsh, that's W-A-L-S-H, @nqa.com. And I am prepared to be able to take those questions if necessary. Obviously, we can't offer one-to-one consultancy, but I'm prepared to be able to take questions. So thank you very much. There's no additional questions come in. So thanks a lot. Thanks for listening and have a good evening. Thank you very much.